Welcome to Market Shapers, a podcast about harnessing capitalism for good. I'm Inder Singh. Over the years, I've had the privilege of working with incredible people, building products, forging deals, and shaping markets that have impacted millions of lives. On this show, I sit down with the leaders, innovators, and behind-the-scenes deal makers who've changed the way markets work, often in ways most people never see. We'll unpack how they did it, what they learned, and how those lessons can help tackle the big challenges ahead. Dai, it's incredible to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Inder. It's great to be here with you. And after all these years, get to jam on this fun stuff again.
You've had an amazing career. You've moved from global health to education and now to climate, doing really entrepreneurial things across all three sectors. The big three, I'd argue, in terms of social impact. Let's start by just asking you the general question. What drew you to this kind of work and what prompted the career change to climate?
It's interesting what you talked about with the big three. I mean, at least for myself, these are the three that I always have been thinking about. How we reflect on the ways the world produces benefits and harms. One of my mentors, who you also got to know in the global health world, Paul Farmer, always used to talk about this concept of structural violence. The basic idea of structural violence is that when someone dies from a preventable disease because they can't afford treatment, or someone is impacted by, a wildfire in the climate world, that's not just bad luck or tragedy. It's not some natural outcome or some personal failing. It's the predictable result of how we've organized society, right? Who gets access to certain things, how opportunity is or mostly isn't evenly distributed. And the key insight of Paul's, I think, is like much of human suffering isn't random or inevitable. It is manufactured by structures we could choose to change, but don't. And that always just struck me as so true of health. It struck me as true of education. It's so true of climate as well. And so even in the 20 years of my career before I worked on climate, I had always been thinking about climate as this other big way in which the world is wreaking structural violence on people, the one that was going to grow the fastest over the next century. And so even though it's at one level weird to jump from health to education to climate, it felt very of a piece to me.
What prompted you specifically to start Cascade? What did you see as a gap, and what are you trying to build with Cascade?
Yeah. Partly it was a feeling that the world hasn't really adopted a fully updated, fully matching the problem grand climate strategy yet. And so we don't at all at Cascade pretend that we're going to be the grand strategists and figure it all out, but we can see the gap between the implicit grand climate strategy the world is pursuing now, some gaps or holes in that strategy, and a need for a kind of revamp. And so partly Cascade is trying to chip away at helping, along with a lot of others, to closing that kind of grand climate strategy gap. Well, even if you've got the right strategy, how do you actually get from here to there, the current state to the future state? And on that front, we felt like the world is not bringing the full toolkit we need to deploy to meet the moment we're in right now. And as a co-founder, I just happen to have, and one or two of my co-founders happen to have some experience watching movies with one particular set of market-shaping tools in that grand toolkit that we felt were being really underutilized in the climate fight. And we felt like we can be part of the crew and bringing a more powerful and more holistic toolkit to the climate emergency response.
You wrote a series of compelling blog posts drawing lessons from global health prior to founding Cascade, I think partly as a foundation for starting Cascade. I'd love for you to summarize your thinking on market shaping as a lever for impact. I'd love for you to summarize what lessons or what insights you were drawing from global health that you wanted to apply to climate.
I have this sense that a couple of things are typically true of our response, as a species, to big challenges. One is when we don't see the outcomes or the outputs we want, we often just tend to pour in more inputs to the same system, right? More dollars, more subsidies, more people working on this. And if we put in more inputs, maybe we'll see better outcomes. And obviously that has a role to resource things properly. But it's not enough because, and I think Paul Farmer's, structural violence concept starts to get at that, because it's if the system stays the same, you're going to see the same well-worn patterns of how things play out. So that's number one. Don't just pour more inputs into the mousetrap and hope that you're going to see different outcomes. And then second, I just feel like we don't bring the whole toolkit that we could be using. And in the climate, we often just tend to rely, and this is weird to say because of how important these things are, but we tend to rely too much on big government policy, which definitely matters and is because of how big these transitions are, how big these economic forces are, how big the dollars are. You need big government policy, but we over-rely on that, as weird as that sounds. And we over-rely on what's sometimes called push funding, just put in more equity funding, more debt, whatever. That's a form of just like more inputs, rather than think about structural change, systematic change. Like if you want to change the mousetrap itself, want to change the system itself, how might you go at that more structurally and with more of a systems approach? And that's how I think about market shaping, is like that's one term to capture a whole bunch of ideas about changing the system itself so that you're getting at some of those root cause reasons why inputs X leads to outcomes Y.
So with that in mind, let's get into the nuts and bolts of this a little bit more. Let's start with the basics. How do you define market shaping?
Yeah.
And
So the closest thing to a definition I came to, and I think you could chip at this, but it's like broadly in the right zone. Market shaping is privately catalyzed efforts to build a shared vision for the ideal future state of a market, and then build a coordinated effort to assemble and deploy soft power and financial heft to steer the market more quickly toward that future state. So you could pick at all the components of that, but there's something about a private catalysis, right? Even if it becomes a public-private thing, there's like a private effort to visualize a future state. This is what we want to work backward from, right? There's a diagnosis of the difference between today and future. And then say, we are really going to take a holistic approach to assembling power, which is a key thing. You have to have power to market shape, but it's not just financial power or government power, like hard power. A lot of it is soft power. How do we assemble soft power and other forms of, influence and steerability? And then how do we put that to work and coordinate efforts to get us more quickly from place A to place B?
with that in mind, to our business friends, to our capitalist friends, I am a capitalist, right? What would you say to them? Because a lot of them might say, leave the markets as they are. They'll result in optimal outcomes. How do you respond to that critique?
I'm curious how you think about that. For me, it's a pretty plain observation of the world that markets left totally unattended produce all kinds of effed up outcomes, all kinds of effed up patterns. One reason we don't do market shaping, certainly among civil society organizations, is that a lot of civil society organizations or NGOs are just instinctively market skeptical, right? They're like, markets are not going to get us where we need to get. And I guess the stance of a market shaper is fundamentally to occupy a middle ground on that question, to neither say, capitalism is what's causing this problem in the first place, which is not without any truth, obviously, or nor at the other end of the spectrum to say, markets will solve this. To choose to be a market shaper is to say there's truth in both of those things, that there's truth in the idea that markets are a powerful way to organize incentives and organize human behavior and action toward outcomes. And they are deeply flawed when left unattended and unregulated in terms of what outcomes you're going to see from that. And so we need to be very active stewards of markets to harness that power toward the outcomes we're hoping for. If you can get aligned on what the ideal state is, then you can get real about how to get there.
I'd love to hear a concrete example on a market shaping initiative where we can draw out an insight for decision makers, an insight from implementers, from global health or from climate.
I mean, we might as well take a live one. So we just announced at Cascade a new data access platform that we're calling the Data Quarry, that is meant to be a market shaping contribution to help enable learning by doing in this first field that we've chosen to tackle as Cascade, which is called enhanced rock weathering. Enhanced rock weathering is an agricultural practice where you spread alkaline minerals on a farm field in ways that react with carbon dioxide to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere while increasing the pH of the soil. And so it sort of doubles as a way to improve soil health while also drawing down carbon. As an intervention, it is in its kind of adolescence. We know enough about this to know that it works. It's part of Earth history since time immemorial, acid-base reactions that regulate carbon levels in the atmosphere. And so what we're trying to do is find a middle ground where the field says, hey, we know enough about this to think that we should start doing this in the real world. This isn't something that should just be in a lab. This is something we should be deploying commercially. And so there is a market that is starting to develop where buyers are paying project developers to go do this, to find the right alkaline feedstocks, to grind it up to the right level, to transport it to a farm field, to build a partnership with a farmer, and then to spread it on the farm field to achieve both these agronomic impacts and these climate impacts. And even as this market is developing, because this is something that's relatively new, there are still a lot of scientific uncertainties. How fast does the feedstock dissolve? How does it interact with different things in the soil? What pathway does it follow on the way to the ocean? Because in the end, you get bicarbonate ions sequestered in the ocean for centuries and centuries. There are scientific questions about the agronomic impacts. There's a lot we need to learn about this system, even as we start to deploy it. So I'd say the organizing principle actually for our work in enhanced rock weathering has been deployment-driven learning, or like learning by doing. We want commercial deployment to happen, but only insofar as we can harness that commercial deployment for public scientific learning about this pathway that enables us to do it more and more smartly over time, more and more affordably over time, and in ways that inspire public trust and confidence and farmer trust and confidence so that the flywheel can really pick up and get going. And so this data sharing system called the Data Quarry that we launched is a way to get at that, because the natural state of affairs right now is project developers go do this. They would naturally just keep that data to themselves and say, this is proprietary data, and that's going to be part of our competitive mode. And so we're reluctant to share that data. What we've been doing is going to the project developers and partnering with them. And there's some very forward-thinking partnered project developers saying, yeah, but for this market to take off, we need to build confidence. And so we have this kind of prisoner's dilemma where we need to ensure that researchers have access to these larger data sets that are coming out of this growing commercial deployment. But that can only happen if someone can come in and create a trusted system, a way where project developers can contribute their data to some sort of central repository, and then researchers can come to that repository and say, I want to do this analysis on the data that's sitting inside the data quarry. Can I have access to it for this purpose? And then we've set up a governing board that makes those decisions instead of asking project developers to just contribute their data to a totally free and open database that anyone could use for any purpose at all. That there are guardrails we can put on this to ensure that this is being used in the right ways to advance legitimate scientific inquiry. So that's a good example of something you might not think of when you think about market shaping, but that is trying to change behaviors and choices to produce a different outcome.
If others were thinking about applying this in a 0 to 1 context, in a new sector, what kind of insights can they draw, or what kind of lessons can they draw from this example and or another example?
Yeah, and you can help me draw some of these out. So you go into a space, in this case, the enhanced rock weathering market, and you sort of ask yourself, how is this mousetrap working, right? Like, how is this market working right now? And you're thinking about, what are the incentives? What are the behavioral norms here? What are the policies and regulations? What are the well-worn patterns of who has access to what information and whose voices are getting heard and not? Just all these like system diagnosis things. So for us, when we did that kind of system diagnosis for enhanced rock weathering, one of the diagnosis elements we came to was feeling like there's a big risk here of insufficient data sharing that is going to constrain the rate of public scientific learning happening on the back of this private deployment. So one general lesson learned is like really doing your diagnosis well. If you go into a new space, you have to start by really doing a listening tour, a bunch of analysis to make sure you're putting your fingers on the right problems, right? Because when we first talked to people about enhanced rock weathering, data access wasn't the first thing they said. They sometimes point to more superficial issues, important issues, but partial issues. And so you need, as a market shaper, to first develop your own convictions around what the issues are or the sources of dysfunction, either current or potential dysfunction are, that you want to go tackle. And for us, data access wasn't the only one, but it was one of the top few things we could do that if we can change the game on that front, we can actually, produce a much faster flywheel of public scientific learning and the trust and confidence that comes with that, and therefore the demand for this thing that's going to flow from all of that, right? And so that's the first thing. And then the second question is like, well, then how do you go do that once you've diagnosed that needs to happen?
I mean, it strikes me that there's an insight here that layers on top of this, which is about information flow. At least in recent conversations with folks about market shaping, the concept of an advanced market commitments come up. And it's like, how can we get a big sum of money to send a demand signal that we want this? And to me, that's the wrong starting point. The starting point is, why do you need the money in the first place? And unless you really spend the time trying to diagnose the problem, understanding what information is not crossing the barrier between the demand and the supply sides, or to funders or investors to sort of say, why does a demand signal need to be sent? If you already had the information that buyers were willing to pay this and they wanted this kind of product, would you really need to put a sum of money against it? Because now you have suppliers saying there actually is a market there. There's someone who's willing to buy. And so it seems to me information is the place you start. It's not always money. You want to start with diagnosing the problem and understanding where the bottlenecks to information flow are. And that's often a huge unlock. Money can be layered on top of that.
Yeah. People are so quick to associate market shaping with big, visible, sexy interventions like advanced market commitments. And so if there's one thing any listener to this came away with in understanding market shaping, it would be, don't equate market shaping with advanced market commitments, or even more generally with demand side interventions.
Yes.
100% agree with that. It's a natural instinct for people to say, oh, I've heard of advanced market commitments. Isn't this about that? And it's like, no, this is about much more than that. And data core is a good example of that. Data core doesn't even really touch the demand side except indirectly. The other piece I'd echo about what you said is, information flows are super critical. Understanding who has access to what information, who is assuming what about where things are going, or versus has these blind spots. So that's big. I would just nudge even further to say the place to start is a holistic diagnosis. Like, money and demand isn't the only part of it. Information is critical, but it's also not the only part of it. I think the right place to start is to really try to understand the mousetrap, try and understand the system. Information flows are part of that. Incentives are part of that. Regulation is part of that. Opinion leader dynamics are part of that. Just like really understand, why is this mousetrap operating the way it is right now? And what are the top few levers that strike us as needing to change if we're working backward from this future state? And again, that begs the question, what is the future state you're hoping for?
Let's talk about who does market shaping. A market shaper is often not a buyer or a seller or a regulator. It's often another type of entity. You've used the term quarterback. I've heard other people use the term orchestrator. I used to use the term neutral intermediary back in the day, right? Just someone who can broker information and broker the deals across the supply and the demand sides. It's really a coordination role across the demand side of the market and the supply side of the market, plus understanding the interests and incentives of funders and regulators. Can you define this role in more concrete terms? And can you also describe why it's important?
Yeah. What's true about the orchestrator, sometimes I even think of like the actual role of like an orchestra conductor, right? Like, who is actually doing that? Because that's fundamentally like a coordination function. So when you think about something like the data query, just to make this concrete, you can diagnose, okay, we need to improve data access. We have this idea of like, there probably needs to be some kind of like permissioned database that we could use as a solution to this. So you can envision the like new piece of plumbing that needs to be introduced, right? But then there's this question of like, well, a lot of people and organizations would need to come together and agree to do this thing. And so then you get this question of, well, who's going to orchestrate that? Who's going to bring that new piece of plumbing into being? And that's where, when you use the term neutral intermediary, what resonates to me in that is that you need someone trusted who is positioned to just play a bit of a go-between role, who doesn't have like a stake in the game themselves per se, right? They're not a supplier. They're not a buyer. They're not a regulator. They are there to try to make the mousetrap work better. And so that's the sense in which neutral intermediary does resonate. The sense in which that doesn't resonate, for what it's worth, when it gets to really understanding the DNA of this coordination function, is you can't really be totally neutral as an orchestrator. You have to have a perspective. You have to have conviction about the future state. You have to be willing to disagree with people, right? Like we'll get into some of these global health examples maybe, but when we were trying to help the world shift toward more patient-friendly tenofovir-based regimens, like I was writing a memo to Bill Gates saying like, you're wrong on this issue and we need you to like see this from a different lens, right? Like that's not neutral intermediary. It's like, you have a real perspective. And so you have to be willing to have the courage of your convictions and like take a stance on things and so forth. And yet you need to be able to do that in a very humble, very curious, very open-minded way that engenders trust. Because the core, maybe I should have put this way up front, the core of this orchestrator role is relationships, trust-based relationships, to earn the right to do this coordination and not come at it with a I'm playing God and I deserve to play God attitude, because you're not going to get anywhere if people just think you have some angle to play or you're high on your horse.
So Cascade, you would say, is playing this quarterback role in the example that you provided around data access.
Yes. And the key thing in what you said is in that example.
Yeah.
I don't think of Cascade as like the orchestra conductor for the ERW market. We call it market shaping, but even with the right approach, you don't play the orchestrator role for the whole market. You say, I'm going to try and orchestrate either this part of the market, or I'm going to work on this issue in the market, and I'm going to try and orchestrate that. So yes, in the narrower sense, I think Cascade is very explicitly trying to offer itself up as an orchestrator for specific market shaping initiatives. Your ability to orchestrate is fundamentally targeted or limited, but you're trying to do that in I hate the word leverage, but highly leveraged roles.
Well, let's take an example from global health. From 2006 to 2010, my recollection is that the price of tenofovir came down roughly 60%. And a lot of this was orchestrated by Chai's work, Chai and Untitled together. And it was a series of initiatives that enabled this drug to come to market and be used, even though it was coming out to market at a price that was higher than the full regimen of 3 drugs to treat HIV/AIDS.
Yep.
Today, tenofovir is being used by nearly 30 million people globally.
Yep.
And I'd argue that that early work helped accelerate the market towards tenofovir. It may have happened on its own. It probably would have, but it might have taken 5 or 10 or 15 years longer.
Exactly. Acceleration. Before this shift happened, HIV/AIDS treatment was starting to scale up, but it was scaling up with a regimen of drugs that was not particularly patient-friendly. A bunch of toxicities of those drugs. You had to take multiple pills more than once a day. Resistance to these drugs sometimes built up quite quickly. And so you had a risk of moving on to even less patient-friendly drugs as like a second-line regimen more quickly than would be ideal. Tenofovir offered a chance. And this kind of gets at like the future state envisioning. Tenofovir offered a chance to get patients on a single pill once a day with a much better side effects profile, and one that might lead to lower rates of transitioning from first line to second line regimens. And so we had pretty early conviction, talking to all the clinicians we had on the team at Chai, that bringing this change about more quickly would both produce better long-term outcomes and would just be much more patient-friendly. And so that was number one, was like diagnosing, okay, and visualizing, we think we can make this shift happen much more quickly than it would happen on its own. Then you get to how do you bring that about? And this is where it gets complicated. But to start with the simple observation that like you need to get a bunch of things to happen. It's not just convincing doctors to prescribe something different, right? It's much more than that. It is on the demand side, on the supply side, with governments who are influencing what goes into the national treatment guidelines and what gets bought. How do we convince buyers to buy this? How do we convince opinion leaders to champion this shift? How do we get the suppliers to start ramping up their production of this and find the cheapest possible ways to produce it? How do you get this virtuous cycle going where the more we start to have this bought, have doctors prescribe it, have people have a good experience with it, the more suppliers are going to ramp up their production, the costs come down, more people buy it, more people get comfortable with it, more doctors prescribe it. So it's really like, how do you get that flywheel going?
So if you're trying to get the world from situation A to situation B, and in this case, tenofovir is a good drug that is more expensive, but better. And you're trying to move the world to situation B, which is tenofovir is widely used at a lower cost, but sustainable cost, because it's still providing a reasonable return on investment that suppliers are still interested. You're trying to move the situation from point A to point B. You have to map and understand the players that would have to change their decisions or behaviors. It's really an incentive mapping exercise.
Yep. So let's just illustrate for the audience like what that means in practice. So for tenofovir, you're not just talking about one or two kinds of people or organizations. You're talking about at the doctor level or the nurse level, what are they choosing to prescribe? That's one thing. And what information do they have access to? Bumping up a level from that, you're talking about the Ministry of Health in Cambodia or Zambia. Are tenofovir regimens called for in the national treatment guidelines? Bumping up a level from that, you're talking about the WHO and their international guidance to countries. What are they writing into their treatment guidelines? Moving laterally, you're talking about suppliers and like what are they choosing to manufacture and what information are they getting from buyers about potential future demand, right? For the buyers, the US it's now under threat, but has this big international aid program for HIV/AIDS treatment, and they're providing funding to buy these drugs. Like, what are the decision makers there assuming about what tenofovir prices might look like 1 year from now or 2 years from now? Then there's like the, Paul Farmer, Bill Gates, key opinion leader question of like, what are their assumptions about this? And in the early going of this, Bill Gates was saying it is a fool's errand to make this shift toward tenofovir because it is more expensive. It will be for a long time to come. And if we eat up most of our HIV/AIDS treatment budget buying more expensive drugs, we're just going to put fewer people on treatment. That's not how it played out, but I understand why he had that perspective and that hesitation. We had to argue against it. You've just got a lot of different decision makers with a lot of different partial pieces of information, partial understanding that together produce a given situation.
It's a great illustration of the problem. You're trying to move the world from point A to point B, and you have to move these entities along in their decisions. And there's regulators involved too. How can we accelerate the approval of more suppliers so that we can create competition that will eventually drive prices down, right? And so in this particular case study on tenofovir, Chai was probably not the only entity playing the orchestrator role, but was a critical entity playing the orchestrator role, right? Mm-hmm. Writing memos, identifying the challenges, working hand in hand with partners to try to change the game. Chai was essentially playing the role of the market, kind of the entity that's saying, I want the market to move in this direction. They're not a supplier. They're not a buyer. They're not a regulator. They're not a funder, an investor, right? But they're playing the role of the market, saying the market needs to go from this position to this position. And I'm going to try to figure out how to coordinate across all the pieces to move the market downstream. What were the attributes beyond trust, beyond humility, that really enabled Chai, in coordination with a lot of other entities, to move the markets here?
Yeah. Let's first just dwell on the most important one, which you use the word trust, but it really goes beyond that. I think of it as like trust-based relationships, and specifically the scope and depth of Chai's trust-based relationships. We just listed out all these different stakeholders who have all these different partial understandings, and all of their behavior or decisions need to evolve for the system to evolve. And so what was truly unique about Chai's positioning is that Chai had trust-based relationships with all of those types of players, not necessarily every doctor or nurse on earth, obviously, but like we knew the key opinion leaders, we knew the major suppliers, we knew the major buyers, we knew the WHO, we knew the folks in the ministries of health who were writing these national treatment guidelines. And so many, many months and years of building trust-based relationships gave Chai, earned it an ability to then partner with all those different folks to say, hey, we could move from here to there if we could just bup, right? Whatever the bup was, we want to do this with you. And so one big ingredient is the scope and depth of relationships. That's what makes orchestration hard, is that you don't just get to come in and introduce some new intervention. You have to actually spend time building that scope and depth of relationships. But it took a bunch of other things too. It's not just that. It took technical expertise, right? Just to take one random example of that, we hired process chemists who actually knew about the chemistry of manufacturing the active ingredients in these drugs, in this case, tenofovir, and worked with the suppliers to say, how could you improve the yield at this step of manufacturing the active ingredient to drive down costs? And how sensitive will that be to scale and all these other technical things? Or on the clinical side, the clinical expertise to help inform the development of the national treatment guidelines. Chai had amazing clinicians on staff who could really be trusted advisors or help connect ministries of health with other trusted advisors to make these decisions in a principled way. So there's a true expertise component to this. There is a ability to move money. Chai partnered with a new organization called United to bring, low hundreds of millions of dollars into this and actually pony up money, not in a full-on advanced market commitment, but in basically an early pooled procurement scheme to just kickstart the demand cycle and say, we'll buy a moderate amount of this to incentivize suppliers to start supplying it, to maybe offer a little bit of forward pricing on where they think this could, get cost-wise or price-wise 6 months from now, and just kickstart the virtuous cycle. And so it is a very multi-ingredient thing to play this orchestration role. And tenofovir really drives that home.
Do you feel like that's the kind of reputation and credentialing and expertise that Cascade is trying to build?
Yeah, I guess I would say you need to have organizational muscles that match the nature of what you're trying to pull off. I would say at Cascade, we don't yet have the caliber of organizational negotiation skill that Chai had, but that'll evolve for us over time. It takes a while to become an effective orchestrator because you have to build these organizational muscles. And that requires bringing the right people in, or bringing in people who haven't seen the movie before and kind of showing them the movie, and they learn it by doing it.
Should there be orchestrators in other spaces?
Yes.
Why and when should there be orchestrators in other spaces? And are there other spaces outside of the ones that you've worked in? You're like, hey, that is a ripe market or ripe sector for an orchestrator to play a role.
Yeah. So first of all, I think there's just a lot of situations where even if you're not going to do some classic sexy market shaping thing like an advanced market commitment, there is a difference between the current state of whatever the ecosystem you're working on and the future state, and some coordination that needs to happen to move toward that future state. Even if it's not primarily market and character, it's just there's a different term that's started to evolve of field building, right? Which is, how do you get a field from place A to place B, even if it has no market character or only some market character? Because there's things about the way that field is operating that are suboptimal. And so this question of when do you need it? I think you least need it when a space is relatively mature and relatively functional, relatively on the right track. For an organization like Cascade to get going, we don't just pick any problem within the climate space. We pick a problem where we feel like we could more quickly become helpful. If we had tried to do Cascade style things for the renewable energy transition, oh my gosh, I don't know if we could have gotten very far. It's a market that's been around for a long time. The transition toward renewables is well underway. The costs have come way, way down. There's a lot of things that are moving in the right direction there. So if we were going to play a role on a more mature, more giant problem like the renewables transition, we probably would have had to pick even a really niche approach to that, right? Renewables in this one particular region or this one particular type of renewable technology that hasn't gotten on the same path as this other more long-standing technology. Kind of like tenofovir was a wave 2 technology, right? So you can maybe pick your spots in a more mature place.
Let's shift a little bit in discussion here. What's happened since our time in global health is there's been a series of new tools that have emerged. Volume guarantees. AMCs were already discussed back then, but they were put into action around the time that we were in global health. In my experience, those tools are all great. The fact that there's really deep thought about each one of these tools and when to use them is wonderful. But it strikes me that that is alone insufficient, right? That
Mhm.
you can only use or apply a tool effectively after the dysfunction is diagnosed and incentives are understood or characterized, like which actors need to change their behaviors. And so whenever I hear we're putting an AMC together or there's a volume guarantee, my first question is, well, who diagnosed the problem? Is that really necessary?
Yep. People tend to jump to demand side interventions very quickly. And then within that, tend to jump toward AMCs and the other most common or most famous, demand side interventions. So, one, I would say we tend to underutilize, even within demand side interventions, we tend to underutilize the less well known demand side interventions. Then there's also this point that, like, when you think about interventions, there's a lot of non-demand side interventions that matter a lot to getting a market from here to there. Like the data access system I mentioned at the beginning is an example of that. Patent pools are an example of that. There are structural things you can do that have nothing to do with better organizing the demand side, but that are still truly market shaping interventions. And then the other layer you are starting to get at is to say, interventions are only half the story. The other question is, who is making sure that those interventions are well designed and well implemented and actually achieve what you want them to achieve, which then depends on all this orchestration kind of function we were talking about.
And one of the things that I've been trying to play with in my head is a framework for how to categorize what economists might call market failures, right? I don't love that term, but the problems that market shaping initiatives can address. And I come back to a really simple framework for how technology is deployed in the world. There's technology development, there's market creation, which means you get to minimum volumes. And many people in the business world talk about crossing the chasm or those early adopter challenges. Like once you get those early adopters, there's minimum sustainable demand for that product or service to continue on. That to me is market creation, right? So you've got technology creation, and then market acceleration. And I'd argue that the work that Chai did was very much in the market acceleration bucket. Took a validated technology and helped bring it to scale faster than it perhaps would have otherwise been achieved. And to me, the really hard work that's being done in climate in particular right now is around market creation. Buying clubs, the work that you're doing on data, like trying to create, and it seems like it's on market creation. How do we get these technologies across the line in initial adoption? Whereas the work that's often gone on in global health is much more market acceleration. Any reactions to that framework, that concept of like, this is an easy way to think about what problems we're trying to solve and what interventions we need. And I'd argue that you need an orchestrator for any of those problems.
Yeah. So, common ground there. I do think that those three broad types of market shaping resonate, and that you need often an orchestrator to pull those off. I also think that they're not necessarily cleanly separate. Like what it feels to me right now is that our work as Cascade and ERW is partly technology maturation. And that's one big difference between my climate experience and my global health experience. Global health, we were mostly dealing with existing products and technologies that had gone through the development pathway, had gone through clinical trials, had been approved. And now it was a question of post-development, post-approval. How do we get these adopted? How do we either create a market or accelerate a market? At Cascade, we're partly helping this technology mature. We're partly helping to create a new market. And we are also partly working with an existing market. It's not like, it's at the stage zero. There is commercial activity happening, and we are trying to accelerate the pace at which that matures in the right direction. You're not always just in one place and not in the others. My diagnosis in climate is that a lot of it is either technology creation, where we're bringing fundamentally new technologies to bear, or market acceleration, where you're trying to accelerate the pace of uptake in an existing market. There are some corners of climate market shaping where you're creating a new market that didn't exist before, and durable carbon removal, which is kind of the realm of climate that enhanced rock weathering sits within, is actually more in that market creation stage of like we're building a market that mostly didn't exist before, and certainly a new category within an existing market. But most parts of climate technology are you're trying to displace an incumbent technology that exists in a deeply ingrained market, and you're trying to accelerate the uptake of something that is greener than what was there before.
What advice would you give someone trying to apply these concepts in a brand new area, outside of climate, outside of global health? What's the advice you'd give them in terms of, I want to leverage market principles to achieve impact, but I'm new? And I've heard this from a number of philanthropists and family offices. This work that is being done in global health is really interesting, or this work that's being done with buying clubs and technology development climate is really interesting. How do we apply it to other sectors? And one of my biggest frustrations, I don't know about yours, since leaving the global health world was, wow, why aren't these kind of approaches being applied in other sectors? So what's your advice for someone who wants to do it?
So maybe we just approach this like this question, like, why isn't more market shaping happening if we get really meta about this, right?
Sure.
My diagnosis of that is the single biggest constraint is there aren't a lot of people who have lived a market shaping movie. There just aren't a lot of people who can do it. And that's not like a skills, or it's not like you or I is any smarter, more talented, whatever than anyone else. The only difference is that we, by virtue of living at Chai for a while these things were happening, like we saw these movies happen, which creates this tacit understanding of like, oh, if I was now trying to apply that to this other space, what might that look like? How would I do a good diagnosis? With whom would I need to build the right relationships? All that kind of stuff. So while it's frustrating at times that there isn't more good market shaping or orchestration happening in more spaces, I really deeply empathize with why that's the case, because it's a relatively new discipline in human history, and there just aren't a lot of people who have done it. And so when I think from that diagnosis into solution space, it's like, well, how do you gradually train up an army of people who have done it so that instead of, the Inders of the world being a scarce commodity, you're a more common commodity? And it's like, well, if I'm starting this thing up to try and decarbonize the cement industry, like there's 150 Inders I could potentially bring onto my team or bring onto my board or, whatever, who could really help with that.
So it sounds to me like apprenticeship is critical.
Ultimately, apprenticeship and just doing the thing. The thing about like what I'd observed now about Cascade is I don't think Cascade is anything grand shakes yet. We're a toddler organization, but just as an illustrative example, like me and maybe one or two other people at Cascade had seen movies vaguely like what we were trying to do at Cascade. Now we have brought, 16 people onto that ship. And a bunch of those people now, if they wanted to go do this kind of thing somewhere else, would have at least spent 2 years watching this kind of movie. And so you and I got it by virtue of being at Chai. Now some other people are getting it by virtue of being at Cascade, or the same at, the small number of organizations that are doing this kind of thing. And so we need, fundamentally an apprenticeship learning by doing model of spreading this approach.
Dai, it's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast. It's been great to reconnect. And I'm so happy that you're working on this stuff in climate, which is desperately needed, and bringing some new energy and new thoughts, hopefully, into the sector.
Well, thank you, Inder. It's been a pleasure to talk this through with you and reconnect on the stuff we used to go fly around the world trying to pull off.
That's right. Thanks for listening to the Market Shapers podcast. I'm Inder Singh. If you enjoyed the show, please like it or leave us a review and subscribe in your favorite app so you don't miss the next episode. Market Shapers is produced by me with help from University FM. Special thanks to Renaissance Philanthropy, Griffin Catalyst, and the Digital Harbor Foundation for their support.